Welcome dear students. In this video I want to talk to you about the JAMstack or the serverless paradigm. They are both very similar, but they have a bit differences and peculiarities. So the JAMstack has become pretty popular in the last few years in the JavaScript community, and the JAM stands for JavaScript API and Markup. And it's just a way of how to build your web application. So there are also just a few slides, but a lot of content. Now, there is a page that advocates for the JAMstack, which is jamstack.org, which tells you, you can build fast and secure sites and apps by pre-rendering your files and serving them from a CDN. This is something that we've already talked about in one of the earlier lessons. You can build your Vue.js application and serve it on a CDN like Netlify, for example. And you can link a GitHub repository to this CDN or this provider, and each time you do a push, your web page will be built and updated. And what this gives you is the ability to not think about servers anymore. You don't need a server configuration, you don't need to be a site reliability engineer, you don't need to be a DevOps, you don't have to have a lot of knowledge about handling servers. You just build your site and you host it somewhere. And JAMstack specifically is talking about static sites. So there are a lot of static site generators, namely Jekyll, Hugo, Nuxt, Next, Gatsby. There is one for every flavor of language, of JavaScript frameworks, whatever. There's even another page linked here, a list of static site generators. All of those can be used to write Markdown, for example, and build a blog out of a few templates, and in the end you get static HTML which you can serve somewhere. Now the JAMstack, the M is for Markdown, also uses APIs to make your sites interactive. And it's more important to talk about what the JAMstack is not. So it's not a monolithic server application like a PHP application or a CMS like WordPress that has to be run on the server and delivers your page. This gives you the benefit of not having to run code on the server, and this way you are not exposed to any of the security issues with running code on your server. It's just static files. It's a security fortress, as some like to say. And with the JAMstack you can also utilize frameworks like Nuxt.js that give you server-side rendering or pre-rendering of your page. And in the browser then your page is hydrated to a Vue.js application and is then dynamic and can talk to APIs. And on this page there are a few examples for the JAMstack. And actually I want you to build a JAMstack application as well, which you've already started, I think. Now, another word that's been tossed around, which is actually a marketing term, is serverless. And there's a very nice page by CSS Tricks, actually it's a microsite, where there's a list of resources, ideas and services regarding serverless. Serverless more or less means you don't have to care about your server. Of course it's still a server somewhere, but serverless means you use services instead of managing your own. You use services for hosting your files, you use services for, authentication, for forms, for hosting of files, for payments, for example Stripe or PayPal. You use services for data storage. You don't manage your own databases, you let someone else do this. All of this can be called serverless. An idea that's also very interesting are serverless functions, which are really just scripts that run on someone else's server. A serverless function, for example, can be, about 100 lines of JavaScript code, and all that it does is it listens for a request and it will then do some I don't know, maybe authorization, and then forward your request or do something on a API server or on a database or something like this. So it's just code that has to run on some server that you don't want to run on the front end, and it's very lightweight, and there are a lot of providers that give you the ability to run serverless functions. I will get into an example later. Then there are also a list of static site generators. There are also CMS services. They are mostly called a headless CMS because they are just the content management system. They don't have a front end. You build the front end for those systems. So, for example, what we have here is Storyblock. You might have heard of Storyblock because it was started here in Linz by a few colleagues of mine as well, and it's a headless CMS that gives you an API that you can consume. So all of your blog articles live in this headless CMS, and you can get a list of blog articles in your Vue.js application and then request a single article and display the single article. So there are all of these services, and the good thing, most of these services have a free plan. So if you're just building a small personal website, you can use most of these services for free. Now, the last thing that I want to talk to you about is an example stack, or let's have a small s here, an example stack for your web application. All of these tools are free to use, and in this example stack I use GitHub for source code management. So anytime I push to GitHub, I want my page to be updated. I can use Nuxt as a static site generator. If you remember from an earlier lesson, Nuxt can also be used as a server-side framework, but in my case I just wanted to build a static site, and I will serve those static files on Netlify, and on the client, of course, it will then be hydrated to a Vue.js application. If you've not seen Nuxt yet, it has also very beautiful documentation. And here's Netlify, which is a free to use CDN. Of course, if you want to have more traffic and use more advanced features, you have to pay for that. And Netlify also can serve your serverless functions. And the good thing with Netlify is you can have your serverless function and your static site or your project that has to be built into static HTML files in the same repository. So there's maybe a functions folder where your functions live. Now, and remember, a function is really just some code that has to run somewhere, and the function can be accessed via a URL. And your function could be a full-blown API, or it could be just a very small thing that you can call that gives you a response. Now, what else does an application need? An application also needs a login and a registration feature, and Auth0 can give us that. Auth0 does identity management. It handles the user registration, it handles social login. So with Auth0 you can also have your user log in with their existing Google account or their existing Facebook account, whatever. And in the end, Auth0 will give you an access token that you can store locally, and you always have to ask Auth0 for new tokens. And with this token, for example, you can talk to your serverless function, and your serverless function can ask Auth0, hey, is this a valid token? If it is a valid token, the user can do things like modifying data, adding new data, and yeah, changing something in your data. Now, and also very important, a headless CMS for handling of files, for handling of content and everything else. Storyblock offers both a REST API and a GraphQL API. Next lesson I will talk in detail about REST API and about GraphQL API. I will go through a full example for this example stack with you, but for now I will just give you a high-level overview of how these parts play together. So this is the story block page, and what's important here to know is that most headless CMSs have a public API endpoint, public REST API in most cases, or in this case a REST or GraphQL API, where anyone can read your data. Just like with any page that you might host somewhere, someone can just call this endpoint and get your blog articles. And usually there's a second API. In the case of Storyblock, it's called the management API, where you have to have certain access or certain permissions to change data in the CMS. So the delivery API is very fast from a CDN, and the management API is behind access management. So how does this look on a higher scale? Now, I do have parts of this on their own slides, so it's larger in the classroom, but for now we can use the big overview. So this is a sequence diagram where you can see the different parts that play together. Of course, you have a user, you have your application, that could be Vue.js, that could be React, whatever, and then you have your serverless services or your different APIs, whatever you might call it. So the blue part here already is a full JAMstack application. I do have my JavaScript, I do have an API, in this case it's the Storyblock delivery API, which hosts my blog articles. And in Storyblock I don't use Markdown, but I could use any other service, or I could use local files for Markdown. So yeah, it's not definitely JAMstack, so maybe we stay with the serverless term for this example. Now, it's very easy to get and render a blog article. The user opens the application uses a public token to get data from Storyblock. Storyblock responds with the data, we re-render the application, and the user sees the blog article, for example. The API key is more or less only used for rate limiting. It's not for access restriction. So this is actually very easy to achieve, and it gets more complicated when you want to authenticate your users or when you want to change data on the server. Now, what's outlined here in the login is an OAuth flow. You can read more about this in the Auth0 documentation, or you search for OAuth 2, or you Google for OpenID Connect, all of those things. To give you just a high-level overview, the user clicks login in your application, and your application will redirect to Auth0. So the user is now not in your application anymore, but he sees the login registration form of Auth0 and maybe a few buttons for social login, like login with Google, login with Facebook, whatever. And in this prompt, the user can enter his data or use a social login. So this is what we can see here. So we're now in this form. The user enters his data and the user authenticates himself. So the user enters the data, and we go back to Auth0, and Auth0 checks if the user is available in the database. Yeah. Or you can also register with Auth0, then yeah, there will still be an authorization code sent to the application. So the application has not seen anything from this flow. In the application, you just ask Auth0, hey, is this a cool user? Then there's a bit of redirects, and the response that the application gets is an authorization code. And the application can then use the authorization code to get an access token from Auth0. So the application tells Auth0, hey, I do have this code and I want to authenticate this user, and please give me a token so I can log me in. Now, with the access token, you now have a token that you can store in your application, and you can always use the access token to get information about your user from auth0, which is cool. The access token can also be stored, so the user stays logged in, but at some point the access token has to be revoked and renewed. But you don't have to worry about this. There's a client for auth0 that does most of these things for you. So in the end, you have a token in your local storage or your cookies, and the user is logged in. After this video, you should search for JWT token, that's JWT, and see what it does and what it can be used for. So now what can we do with this login besides getting user data? We can use this token to authorize the user to do various stuff in your API, like uploading new files, creating new articles, adding comments and stuff like this. So we're now in this third part, which is a post example. The user wants to submit a form. The user submits the form with the access token that we've talked about, or with the JWT. Now we're in a serverless function here. Because we don't have a backend application, we just have a small serverless function. And the serverless function can then take this access token and ask the can then ask the identity provider, is this a valid JWT? Does this user exist? Does this user have the permission to do what he wants to do? Then auth0 says yes, that's cool, and the serverless function will then talk to the Storyblock management API and change some data, add some data, upload a file. Storyblock will then respond with, hey, that's cool, and the Netlify function or your serverless function will then also respond with, hey, everything went all right to the application, and you can show the user a success message. What you can see back here is there's also authorization involved here, because not any serverless function is allowed to change something in your Storyblock instance. So this is why you'd use a different token that only your Netlify function knows to authenticate yourself in the Storyblock management API. So this is also why you need serverless functions. There is always some code that you can't serve to the user because it can't be public. Your management API token can't be public, only your serverless function is allowed to know it. So only your serverless function, and only if the user is allowed to, can change data in your CMS. This is all very high level and all very theoretical, and next time I will do a full example with you with all of these different parts. Yeah, and that's it for now regarding the JAMstack and serverless. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So see you tomorrow and have a good evening.